Cindy Frewen. I am an architect and an urban futurist living and working in the center of the United States in Kansas City area. I actually live on the Kansas side, so a lot of the statistics that I look at have to do with a more rural state. The coronavirus tends to be in cities because that's where most of the people are. And what I study is cities, but I also look at the rural region. And in Kansas anyway, there's been about 10 outbreaks and 3 of them happened in churches. This is Easter Sunday, and they had a lawsuit about whether or not the governor could close the churches or tell them that they couldn't have gatherings of more than 10 people. The Supreme Court overturned that, and we'll see if there's a corona outbreak here in about 2 weeks. So Kansas is always famous for its judgments like that, and we continue to bicker about whether or not to stay safe during a major epidemic, pandemic, yes, a pandemic. So, good morning for us, good afternoon for many of you. I don't have this recording, so I'm going to try to hit this button and see if they'll let me do this. Yeah, they did. And I do use this platform when I'm teaching at the University of Houston. I practiced as an architect for 25 years, and then I have been teaching and working as an urban futurist for the last 15. And so I'm very familiar with Zoom, but that doesn't mean I don't stumble around on it a little bit. So let me look for sharing screen, share the right one. There we go. I think that's going to work. I think I can see that. There we go. Okay. So I look at disasters quite a bit. Pandemics are a different sort of animal. They're a form of a disaster, but they're not necessarily considered in the urban futures category as much. This one happens to have a spatial aspect to it. The social distancing is all about space. And so people have been asking me about what that means to the future of architecture and the future of cities. And I'll get into that in a little bit. I look at such huge change that I added massive change because in fact, some change is really slow. And like, for instance, Detroit is a place that has had massive change over decades and hasn't ever, and probably never really will recover. So it takes on a whole new shape than what it had before. Other places have a disaster that's really intense all at once. This coronavirus is sort of an unfolding disaster. It didn't happen as a single event like an earthquake would, but it did have, it is unfolding apparently from what I read, that the framework is months or years. And so it could be with us for quite a long time. Cities are all about stories, and one of the best places for stories is Twitter. And all of a sudden, everybody's inventing what does this mean to them. Well, as this one tweet that I found turns out my top 3 hobbies are eating at restaurants, going to non-essential businesses, and touching my face. How many of us have been thinking about this touching our face issue? Well, I like a little entertainment on my COVID-19. And so here we are in the US anyway. Ramen noodles are something college students eat a lot of, but not anymore. Now everybody wants them. Or here we have the self-quarantine at my boss's house. So far, so good. Not a bad place to hang out, you can see. 400,000 people like that, by the way. And then we have a more generational story from Twitter. Our grandparents were called to war. We're being called to sit on your couch. You can do this. It's a hashtag quarantine life. This is the new life we have, is sitting in our houses, avoiding our friends and family, and trying to make sure everybody stays safe. Not necessarily stay healthy, because of course, being alone can be very unhealthy as well. There's all kinds of ways to make this a better or worse situation. But I like it that somebody would notice, by the way, the grandparents went to war. They're just having to sit on the couch. It's hard though. It's not as easy as it sounds, right? So how do we think about it when it comes to COVID-19 in cities? What difference is it going to make? What are we going to be seeing with cities now? The thing about looking at a pandemic while it's unraveling, while it's happening, I think many people have been noticing that futures have been talking about pandemics for decades, but they were one of many scenarios. Anyone that talks about collapsonomics, as my friend Vinay Gupta says, collapsonomics, they have to look at germs and diseases, because that is one way that you can wipe out whole populations. But how do we think about it in terms of cities? What does it mean? Well, I look at disasters a lot, because disasters are a moment in time where places change dramatically. And when they change dramatically, you can change for the better or the worse. Usually there's larger trends that have to do with whether or not they already have things happening in their favor. That even if even their best hopes can't come true, because they have so many outside external forces that are destroying their chances. It comes to mind a place called Greenberg, Kansas, which is a town in western Kansas that got hit by a tornado a few years ago, probably about 10 or 12 years ago now. And a lot of people came to to save it. A lot of people brought in big money to save this little small town because it was so completely destroyed. So they built back very much like what they had, only much greener. It's a much greener place. The problem it has is that it's on this Ogallala aquifer, very close to it, which is an aquifer that's going dry. And so there's these larger trends of rural depopulation combined with the aquifer, which is said to be going dry in parts right now. It just can't overcome. And so it's shrunk in half. No matter what you do with a town, if you only have half as many people, it's a lot less vibrant. So pandemics, there are some people putting together really great graphics on this issue. And you can see in this image, I hope you can see my cursor, but down here at the very bottom, it's a timeline and also the size of the pandemics. You can see that the AIDS epidemic was really the latest huge global pandemic, but it unfolded over 2 decades, right? Or now 4 decades. And the last 2, it has had some solutions. The first 2, it was really devastating. And so it's really a tale of, it's had 2 different stories, although still a very terrible thing to have happen. It's not as devastating as it was in the 80s and 90s before there was real solutions. Hopefully the COVID virus really will have vaccines before the things that can't happen for AIDS, which was so slow. The HIV/AIDS, it's a far slower set of scientific answers. But you can see that since then, there have been many little epidemics, but they are really not been as influential as some of the larger pandemics in the past. And there's a reason for that. There's a part of the science has come to help, but I think it's not just science. It's also us. It's also our relationships and our networks and how we communicate this information, is that people are able to get this information in time to act on it. And that has been more true about this epidemic or this pandemic than any. I'm so sorry. I've had a long night, a long month of healthcare issues here. And so I'm really quite tired. But you can see that it's nowhere near its full, it's not complete. And so it's impossible to put that in this framework yet, but still at this time, it is a far smaller pandemic than many others in the past. But here we are in modern era. And can we actually not have millions of deaths? Can we actually avoid millions of deaths? That is a point. Then will it be called that it wasn't as big a deal? Or will it be called that it is? Okay, are you seeing weak signals in the US? I don't mind taking these questions. And hi, Alex, how are you? Good to see you here. Yeah, well, yes, that's right. It's just now getting to the rural districts, right? It starts where people came in from other parts of the globe. And that was New York, as it turns out, most dramatically for us in Washington to start with, but they weren't as dense and weren't as rubbing shoulders as New York was. But now we're seeing this coming to the smaller areas like this. And what will happen 2 weeks after Easter? That'll be very telling for us. And certainly Italy's countryside didn't get out of it, right? It didn't just stay to the cities. So it's just so contagious. That is the most dramatic thing about this, is it's contagious. And that's why we have the social distancing and masks and gloves and all of the things that we can do behaviorally while we don't have a vaccine, we don't have scientific answers yet. So one of the things that people can do in preparation was their medical infrastructure, including the PPE and the beds. The beds were, and ventilators with the ICU units. These beds tend to have ventilators with them. And so you can see there was quite a difference between Germany and Portugal in Europe, just comparing. This is strictly EU numbers. And you can see that there is a huge variety of emphasis on preparation. In the United States, here you ask about rural, Alex. In March, the FBI processed over 3.7 million requests for guns, and which is almost 1 million more than last month. And 2 million guns were purchased in a country that already has more guns than humans. You know, is that we already have this huge number of guns, but people that had never purchased guns before, first time people are purchasing guns. They show pictures. You can find pictures. I do a lot of things with images, and you can find images of stores bought out. Well, toilet paper and guns, as it turns out, become very high demand. But I want to point out that this is in a framework of larger pandemics, right? Is that here we have the largest threats around the world. Pew Research Center has been surveying this of government leaders and various people that should be able to place an idea on risk. And they look at what would be the major risks, and climate change, the various political threats of ISIS, and which is the pink color, the reddish pink. Hold on, I backed up. Previous. I'm trying to move my slide so I can see it all. And various countries that are threatened by adjacent neighbors. So the political threats, and then the economic instability that you see for Russia and a couple of the African nations. But nevertheless, the point is that there was no health mentioned in this survey by any of these leaders. Their top concerns didn't include a pandemic, which has landed on us as both a pandemic for health as well as a huge economic ripple. I'd like to say that almost every innovation and every economic change, certainly every innovation in cities has had some health reason for happening. There's been a health component, if not a health motivation, like in any plumbing and any fresh air, fresh water, sanitation, have always got a health benefit to them, have always got a health intention. They aren't always just economic based. They may have economic consequences, but they have health, they're health driven. So here we have this, this image that has, that shows that the people between now and 2100, another large major trend besides where's the health on a risk assessment by leaders, is what about the larger picture of population change? this represents both first aging and then later fewer population decrease, depopulating of the world. As you see, the whole curve is flattening off. That means in the 2100, in the 22nd century, there would be a very different looking curve probably. But the big story here for the last half of this century is this list of countries that will be shrinking, in particular China, which may be already shrinking. Certainly it's aging at a rate that we've never seen before. So here's the list of the countries that will be gaining are almost entirely in Africa. US is an unusual one, and that's mainly through immigration, which has been slowing dramatically. And this pandemic could cause globalization and immigration to change so dramatically. So, wait 1 second, please. So, I had to get my clock where I could see it. But then on the other side, on the right-hand side, China, Japan, Brazil, Thailand, South Korea, Italy, Russia, Ukraine, these are huge levels of change. And what happens to cities when they shrink at that rate, when they have that much less people? 52% on Japan, 52 million rather on Japan. That's a lot of infrastructure. So what is this? Anonymous attendee says, what kind of urban infrastructure protects us from this, and what kind of urban infrastructure housing situation in terms of architecture would you say has a positive impact on people during these times? So you know, one of the things I notice that happens with areas that are dense is they get these sing-alongs, or they get games that they are playing because they're so close. We're in a pandemic and a lockdown for some months. Are we in it forever? It seems to me like the places that are going to recover faster are the ones that have stayed in touch with each other, and they stay in touch because they are so close to each other. And so I still think that the density has a benefit. I think people that are on the farm are in a house by themselves without family. People living alone right now, I think, have the largest risk because of isolation. And the closer they would be to even hearing other people, to being close to other people, I think would be a benefit if they were by themselves in a house where they saw nobody. That, I think, is a less, it'll be harder to recover. There's a mental illness and mental anxiety that happens when you're in isolation. So will we now have nothing but distance between us and everybody else? I would say that is not likely. Maybe I can see where we'll be more careful, right? We'll be more careful, but there's been other pandemics. We haven't ever decided that we're not even going to be close to each other. No more. We aren't going to be the hugless society. We aren't going to be the touchless societies. The damage to people, unless, of course, there is no way to cure it. So you have to believe in science for you to believe optimistically that we will find a way to live together, not alone. Otherwise, having 8 or 9 billion people on Earth is going to be really, really difficult, won't it? It'll be really impossible. I can see where we will be a lot more cautious. There was New York Times has got some images that they promoted that they got from Gensler on, which is an architecture firm, of new conferencing and that sort of thing. And people were using their own devices. And can't you see where people might be using their own devices more instead of using community devices that they don't know about the germs, for instance, that are there. And so they don't have to go through the cleaning process. They keep their own things. They don't have to touch the elevator buttons, for instance. I don't know if yeah, I can see where there could be some remote ways of controlling these with voice or with viewing, with yeah, probably there's going to be more audio and more video ways of getting in and out of buildings and in and out, up and down buildings without touching things. We touch things way too much if we aren't going to share, if we can't share germs, right? Because in those cases, you have no choice but to touch things. And so, you know, I think even still, you'll find that people are healthier if they have a chance to be in a park or be outside. I can't imagine that we wouldn't be able to do that. Cities will be unlivable if we can't. And without being able to live in cities, we sure can't support this number of people. It's been a very efficient thing that we have is density. Density allows us to have more social events, more things that we can do, more interesting things we can do. It creates innovation. Being near people makes people invent things, and as well as makes us happier. So I think there has to be, we'll find a way. I'm an optimist that way. How could you be a futurist? Well, there are negative futurists, actually. 10 years, 260 million people displaced by climate change. So again, I want to put it in perspective. 260 million people, it's not the population of the US now, but it was just a few decades ago. Is it that many people are displaced every decade? And it's increasing. This is an increasing number. This is just averaging out this 26 million that the Pew Research people found at this time. And but it's increasing. So there's this estimation that there will be more and more people displaced. And that has an economic impact as well. So there's other kinds of disasters to be looking at besides pandemic. You can see here where the greatest problems with climate change will be happening over the next 50 or 100 years, and who has the most vulnerability and why it happens. It's the weather, it's sea level rise, where 80% of the people are living within 100 miles or so of the coasts. It's agriculture and productivity loss. It's massive changes that we'll be seeing between population and climate change, and technology, and now, as it turns out, pandemics. There's people with all kinds of ideas of how we can, what we can do instead, and that's underway, right? In many cases, but not entirely. And so now people on the COVID-19, that piece that I talked about just now was just to say there are these other greater, huge impacts on the globe that are happening already. And this is then ongoing. As you saw from the map of pandemics over time, there's an ongoing, there's many ongoing diseases like this. And our learning lesson from all of it is how do we respond faster? How do we respond more safely? How can we respond without putting everybody out of work like we've done this time? And how do we plan ahead for that? Do you think that they will lose urgency? You know, that's a big question. Do they have urgency? I mean, here's a problem, at least in the US. I would hope it would get more urgency when you see the effect of disasters in general can affect the entire globe. And that's the difference with climate change and most other kinds of disasters. They don't usually affect everybody, whereas climate change really does affect everybody. And so does this pandemic. That's what makes it unique. McKinsey's been trying to put together charts, and a number of the large economic groups, global groups, have been trying to put together things about what would make this come back. And I don't know, ironically or unfairly, or however you want to look at it, that in this case, they're showing that the Eurozone and the world will get burned more than China and USA, which are the two big giants who have had quite a bit of the pandemic. But so is the Eurozone, if you look at it as a united group. And they certainly are when it comes to trade, going across boundaries, across the political boundaries. They certainly travel amongst that's one of the things about the Eurozone that's been very united, more united than some of the other aspects of it. But and that is why, and probably why, because you can't control the whole thing. Just like you can't, it's hard to control all of America, unlike China is able to control regions much more carefully. And that's one of the differences, is how well do people listen and how well does the authorities do the authorities control. So the changes they see really bottoming out all this year, more or less, and coming back, you know, towards the end of the year. If you look further in these kind of numbers, it's a 3 or 5 year process. It's a long process, just like it was 2008, only maybe it's been very much more dramatic right now. So I promised I'd talk about some cities that have done well after disasters. San Francisco is a place that is just has a series of these earthquakes, but 2 huge earthquakes, of which first one in 1906, about 100 years ago, they didn't necessarily learn all the lessons, and they started building things right on the fault line and ended up with problems like this. The Embarcadero, which was this massive, you know, double tier, 3 tiers of travel that you could, that actually covered up the entire, the Bay Area from downtown. It really was a separation. And so they've ended up getting rid of that and turning it into one of the greatest cities in the world. This is a story where they had to learn a lesson more than once. And once it was learned, and in fact, in the last 20 years, cities have gotten better at learning the lessons of being more human, more people-oriented, less just technology, more about creating unique places. And that was true, always true, when before cars, but the United States cities got sort of decimated by that sameness, by being the same instead of being unique. Well, I think anyone that's been to San Francisco would say it's a unique place. And it was the first city in America to shut down for the coronavirus. Berlin was another place where it went through years and years, decades and decades of planning and thinking and finally designing and building. And what a disaster after World War II was then brought back in a whole new way and has benefited from years of working on it before they actually did the building, and actually then have capitalized on it, and is again one of the most vibrant cities in the world. On the other hand, we have Detroit. The before and after, the after is much worse. The before, it wasn't that great, but in many parts, although this isn't fair. This is an unfair image just because I was hurried, but there are beautiful parts of Detroit. Detroit was really quite, and still has beautiful parts, but it has these very sad parts as well. And it's never been growing back in those areas, or if it does, it would be quite a different way. It'd grow back in a very different way. And the point being that it was because of these larger economic decisions that were made that were not necessarily towards building a great city. And in the end, it decimated it. Cities take a long time to build. I like showing this slide to show how long it took to build New York City, contrasted with how long it took to build Shanghai in its more recent form. So 137 years versus 25 years. Now we can build much faster, and even faster and faster if you start looking at things like how we build with 3D printing and towers that you can build in 19 days. So designing a dream city is easy, according to the great Jane Jacobs. Rebuilding a living one takes imagination. It's hard to rebuild cities, and it's hard to remake them and reimagine them. But cities have been doing it successfully. Some have not. And many times they have to accept a smaller size than what they had before. And that is true, more and more true, is that prosperity can't be not necessarily defined strictly by growth. What is this now? The ventilation is said, yeah, right. And so here you have it, is that in green buildings, you're supposed to be using more fresh air, and fresh air wouldn't be sharing ventilation like you do in an airplane. Like an airplane is the definition of bad ventilation. And so because it's all recycled air, there is nothing else to have. And it has no filtration, right? It's just basically you're getting this recycled air. And so it's a terrible environment for humans to be in very long. The theory is that you aren't there very long. And hopefully that's one of the things that we will fix, is this toxic environment you are on a plane for such a long period of time if it's a long haul flight. The buildings that didn't have operable windows, I think, are much worse on the issue of ventilation, but new buildings that meet green building guidelines almost always have ventilation, and natural ventilation. Mechanical ventilation is an area that hopefully this might make them make those better. That might require better standards. What that'll mean is more machine, and bigger fans, bigger ducts, all of that, and less, of course. Instead, we look more and more towards natural. My feeling always has been that we have over-designed things, and over-designed them in terms of the engineering. So how can we actually reduce all of that? That is for me, in green building, sustainable living, regenerative buildings tend to be easier on energy use, not more. Easier on ventilation needs, not more. And that they use the things that are easily done just by good design, just by making good design. And instead, and that's true about infrastructure as well. It isn't just the buildings, but it's true about the infrastructure as well, is that we created too much partitioning off, too much mechanized responses, and that those should be more, let's say, mitigated by natural, that they can be a much more using natural physics as opposed to using mechanized. So cities that are doing better with COVID-19, the ones that did the early detecting, and they're going to continue to do testing, right? The testing is the key. We're hearing about this too much in the U.S. since we were late to the testing table, and are now trying every kind of invention. All these brilliant people are using their skills to find ways to get around early errors. So but this early detection, there's some of the Asian countries especially were like South Korea, where they're tracking people, because you have to not only detect, but track and communicate. Containment, like they did with Wuhan, and now opening that back up. We'll see how that goes. They're really a test case. It's a very high risk thing to open back up. Obviously, they think they can shut it down so quickly. In America, people don't listen that quickly. So it's cultural. And I think more than anything else, then you get down to communication and leadership. And that becomes the difference between the ones that manage it and don't, is the ones that tell the story that makes people listen and respond, and that get consistent messages that way. And that people believe and that they trust. Leadership becomes very critical in change when it comes to disasters and pandemics and massive change in cities. Today, many people who live in those big cities, the mega cities, were not born there. They do not have personal links. How critical do you think citizen identity is? Can we take care of something we do not feel is ours? Yeah, well, I think you are taking care of it. And so even if you're visiting, you are having an impact on the place. And visitors, if you've been in Europe in the summer, they have massive impact on the place. And one of the industries that's been hit the most dramatically is a tourist industry because we're shutting down, right? And what do? You can't get the same experience unless you go to a place. And so you're talking about the mega cities, the 30 or 40 mega cities, which are over 10 million people. And they have strangers. They're full of strangers. Cities have always been full of strangers, and many times strangers do really good things for cities. Newcomers many times do really good things for a place. How well do the people that are there tell the story to the newcomers? How well do newcomers then impact the place because they do change it? How well does that integration happen, or that, in many cases, differentiation? Sometimes cities have this tendency to, when newcomers come in, they end up living in slums. They end up living in really poverty level temporary conditions. And so long as that is temporary, as they get into the next socioeconomic class, or as they get into another more prosperity and begin to live the dream of that city, they move out of that. If they then stay in that situation, then it becomes entrenched and it is permanent, and can be can have the benefits of community, but not necessarily of health, safety, and not of the other benefits of being in a more living environment, an environment that's more humane, well-designed, higher quality types of places. Although I have to say that there's well, I'm sure all of you have seen the terrible infrastructure that happens many times in slums, and that happened in almost every city goes through that phase. Whether or not they stay in that phase is the key, is that they have to get enough prosperity to allow people to move on. And if they don't, then that becomes blight and crime and other difficulties. So I think people do come in. I've seen newcomers come in and make huge changes that are beneficial to a place that they may have moved to. I don't want to say accidentally, because everything's, you got there for a reason, but that they did the right thing. They found the right things to do. I've seen it happen the other way too, right? People come in and they have no understanding and they make mistakes, and it's permanent and it's long-term. Changes to cities are very, very long-term. Cities are naturally a long-term issue. I mean, just general planning is a 25-year process. So long-term planning in terms of futures is a 50 and 100-year process. And that's why trying to judge this as it's unfolding is really difficult. What makes trying to give it perspective and relevance, and how is it going to look in history, and but from a future standpoint, many of our decisions were done before it started. And how could we then learn from it instead for the next undoubtedly future pandemics? This is the story, this is the reason, because there is an urgency with a pandemic. There's always an urgency. There's a vision, which is this thing about identity and knowing the purpose, intention of the place, where it's going and how it can be there the best, how it really can find its own true nature. And then that comes to leadership, whether or not that group of people that in leaderships come out of the community, they come out of every person involved in the place, and whether that is the difference that makes places change for better or worse. So this lead to more gentrification in the US. So many things have continued to lead to that gentrification. And so it's I don't know if I think it's going to be more than it already is, right? I mean, I still see this as something in the sub 5-year category, although it could be rolling, in which case then you have larger plans that then it becomes a city issue. Is that then 20 years from now, we'll say, well, we've made those changes because of the COVID-19. And that was true certainly true in the United States and across the world in terms of terrorism. In the last 20 years, terrorism and security has dramatically impacted how we come and go out of countries and out of buildings but how do we oh, what's this? It says, oh, okay. I now see that our moderators were inputting there a little bit too. So how can megacities live with old infrastructure, which is hard to enhance? I think tear it down, pretty much tear it down. That's very flip. I'm not sure, it's not true, but I think over time, the huge infrastructure that we have done needs a lot of revamping. It needs to be lighter so that it can be revamped again and again, because it is so outdated. And it's just an albatross. This is so around our neck. And how do we give up something we've invested so heavily in? It's hard. And then so the transition is a difficult process, very difficult, but needs to be done. The cities that are disasters do this for cities. It creates the urgency that otherwise they may never get. And so it's time for them to use this, if they can, to make their cities more humane, more, in this case, safe, healthy. But healthy is a big word. Health and well-being is the way of cities now, as opposed to being the dark, dank places that they were making 100 years ago that we're so full of, totally full of sicknesses and bad air and bad water and bad sanitation. And these things we need to have, as we're putting in new structures, they should be as light as they can be so they can be changed again and again. So marketplaces as well as supermarkets remaining a main problem of spreading the virus. Yeah, we weren't thinking about all our germs, but you know, we have to be able to handle germs too, because we are germ laden, every one of us. And so how do we become better? Like I said earlier, you can think about not having to touch things. It's another old antiquated thing to have to touch all these doors and touch all these places that everybody else has had to touch too. And so how can that be minimized? And it wasn't a very good plan in the first place. So yeah, I think at that level, at that micro scale, that's where changes can be that are effective and that we will all be healthier because of it. And how to advocate, like I said, I think a pandemic, if that's not an urgency, whatever it is, 100% delivery. So this is one of the things that is changing and was changing more slowly is a virtual life. How many of these people are really going to say, hey, I have to be in the office when they find out they can do so much at home and that they avoid that commute some of the time? I mean, it's always been this leftover industrialized image that we all go to work at the same time and come home at the same time and peak hours on the highways and making this and on the transit systems. And then they sit empty over the weekends and they sit empty over the night. It's a very inefficient. Hopefully we'll find a more natural way of how we can work both and use our space better, because cities are full of unused space. They're just completely wasteful. And just look around now how much unused space there is. Well, we aren't doing anything, for one thing. We're sitting on our couches. But there could be some more mindful use of both our homes versus our workplaces versus our shopping. There's still really something about going out shopping at marketplaces that's very rich. I see where they're opening up those street markets in Wuhan, and I'm thinking, what would it be without that? And the souks and you think about the world markets and how fabulous they are. To not have those would be such a loss. There has to be a way of making it work. And then in our normal markets, the ones that we see in our neighborhoods that are not quite as fabulous, but are where we use usually. The people that we get more conscientious about sharing our germs with everyone. That seems to me that we've been quite loose about that. But bodies are made to get good and bad germs in them all the time. Our bodies are very powerful that way. maybe there are other health issues that we can get better at, that both our own human systems, which is where it all starts, combined with the infrastructure systems, that is a more regenerative, more alive, more humane way of being. I like that question though. 100% delivery. It's very likely if they would let the drones loose, they would let the drones loose, which I don't know any place that's done that yet, other than for emergencies, healthcare, delivering to things like islands or remote places. They're using some drones, but I think that's one of those things that this opens up some new things, new ways of being that were taking a longer time to get here, that could happen a lot faster. Thanks for that, Allie and Patrick. Thanks, both of you. Allie, I didn't mean to be flip about just tearing it out. But that is basically the answer for resilience and green, is that we didn't build things to be green. And so it is a lot of replacement that has to happen to get things to that level. But as you replace, of course, that's not very green either. But certainly there's a lot of old infrastructure that's out of date. So.